Simone de Beauvoir, who met her as a student for the first time during this period, was impressed by her capacity to feel the suffering of others. In reply to Simone de Beauvoir's suggestion that the main problem in life was not to make people happy but to discover the reason for their existence, Simone Weil said it was easy to see she had never been hungry. Her second attempt at entry to the École Normale was successful. She came top of the list, Simone de Beauvoir second, and in 1928 they entered the École Normale, joining the 3 women already there, nicknamed the Gleaners. While there, Simone Weil continued to attend legally Alain's classes at the Henri IV. It was in one of the 1929 issues of his journal, Libre Propos, that her earliest essay concerning the nature of labor was published. Concerning perception, or the adventure of Proteus, was an attempt to define work. She regarded it as true action, not that which emanates from the passions, from the unbridled imagination, but action that conforms to geometry, that is to say, which is brought into being through knowledge of the world that is gained by moving progressively from one simple idea to another. It is through work that reason seized hold of the world. Simone Weil lays stress on the importance of advancing from one clear notion to the next. She believed, like Alain, that philosophy is the explanation of the obvious through the obscure. The connection between her experiences at the working men's school in the Rue Falguière and her studies at the École Normale Supérieure was crucially important. It provided the link between her most deeply held beliefs and the means of their implementation. At the school, renowned for the independence of spirit of its students, Simone Weil acquired a reputation for eccentricity. Hers was not, however, the cultivated originally typical of both Europe in general and of that decade in particular. It was a genuine nonconformity with contemporary social standards that required courage to maintain and which must have made her miserable. She worked phenomenally hard, and whether as a result of doing so or of other factors, severe and near incapacitating headaches from which she was never entirely free began during this time. She became associated with various pacifist movements by brusque and uncompromising demands for support and signing petitions connected with them, in drawing up manifestos, and in particular with soliciting contributions for trade union strike funds. She made several enemies. She was not widely popular with her peers, but it was by the school's administration that she was viewed with the greatest hostility. This was to have serious repercussions when it came to her placement after she had reviewed a brilliant degree in 1931. Having expressed a preference for a post in a port or in an industrial town in the north of the center, she was posted almost as far away as possible to Le Puy, allegedly at the request of the dean. During her university career, Simone Weil had joined a group associated with the review de la Révolution Prolétarienne. Upon her arrival in Le Puy, she contacted syndicalist groups and at the large industrial town of Saint-Étienne, some 70 miles away. It was here that she began to frequent industrial workers' milieu for the first time. Although she was working as an intellectual and being well paid for it, she regarded this as a mere quirk of fate and considered that since so many others had the right to nothing, she too had a right to nothing. Her career at Le Puy was dramatic and short. While teaching at the lycée, she made weekly trips to Saint-Étienne to attend and teach at workers' study circles and to attend meetings of the militant trade union groups under the leadership of Pierre Arnaud, recently expelled from the Communist Party. La Ponaud, as she became known, donated the supplementary pay she got for being an agrégée towards the purchase of books for the study groups. She lived on the 5 francs a day, then being allocated as an employment benefit, and thereby contributed substantially of the miners' strike fund. She very soon ran into trouble with the educational authorities in Le Puy, leading deputations of unemployed workers into council meetings, writing strongly worded letters of protest to the local press, carrying the red flag in the demonstrations, and allegedly insisting workers to strike. She scandalized the people of Le Puy and was twice required to resign her post at the Élysée and to ask for change of placement. Her awkwardness and dislike to compromise often caused distress to those immediately around her. Recognizing her clumsiness, this time it was her pupils who were her protectors. There is no doubt that in particular terms they suffered directly in consequence. At the end of her year at Le Puy, the examination results of her teaching were catastrophic. Only a fraction of her class got through their bachelor in philosophy. Whether through unfair marking or because of her unorthodox teaching methods is not clear. Nevertheless, her teaching was unforgettable. Anne Reynaud-Guéritat, her student at Rouen, writes, Simone Weil is by now already well known and is portrayed by some as the greatest mystic of the century and by others as a revolutionary anarchist, so I thought it would be of interest to introduce her quite simply as a teacher of philosophy. She taught me at the girls' secondary school at Rouen during the school year 1933-4. Our class was a small one and had a family atmosphere about it. Housed apart from the main school buildings, in a little summer house almost lost in the school grounds, we made our first acquaintance with great thoughts in an atmosphere of complete independence. When the weather was good, we had our lessons under the shade of the fine cedar tree, and sometimes they became a search for the solution to a problem in geometry or a friendly conversation. I could waste time by reminiscing at some length about some strange rows that took place. The headmistress coming to look for marks and positions which Simone Weil usually refused to give. Our orders to rub out the Platonic inspiration we had written above our classroom door. No one admitted unless he knows geometry. But I share the distress of Gustave Thibon for such reminiscence. Like him, I loved her too much for that. If a brother cannot speak of his sister as a writer can about a fellow writer, neither can a pupil speak in the way of the teacher she admired so much and who has had such a profound influence on her. One must aim higher than that. Long before she became famous, I had carefully kept all my notes of her lessons. Simone Weil was too straightforward, too honest, to cram us for exams in lessons and keep her real thinking for other times. I think I can declare that there are not two Simone Weils as people are bringing to say, and that is why I have stifled my scruples, although at first I was afraid of shocking people. People do not like to be suddenly presented with an image of an artist, writer, hero, or saint which is quite different from the one they had previously formed in their minds. My scruples were vain. The Christian, by instinct if not by baptism, who in 1943 died in a London hospital because she would not eat more than her ration, was the same person I had known, sharing her salary in 1933 with the factory workers of Rouen. The same person, too, were the mystic put in the void before the real, the well-known call, as she put it, of the void for grace, and the physicist who, when speaking to us of verification, humbly allowed the facts to speak for themselves. Reynaud-Guéritat, 1978. Simone Weil described her own teaching in a letter to a colleague. Dear comrade, As reply to the inquiry you have undertaken concerning the historical method of teaching science, I can only tell you about an experiment I made this year with my class, philosophy class at the Lycée for girls at Le Puy. My pupils, like most other pupils, regarded the various sciences as compilations of cut and dried knowledge arranged in the manner indicated by the textbooks. They had no idea either of the connection between the sciences or of the other methods by which they were created. In short, such knowledge as they possessed about the sciences could not be described as culture but the opposite. This made it very difficult for me to deal with the part of the philosophy syllabus entitled Method in the Sciences. I explained to them that the sciences were not ready-made knowledge set forth in the textbooks for the use of the ignorant, but knowledge acquired in the course of ages by men who employed methods entirely different from those used to expose them in textbooks. I offered to give a few supplementary lectures on the history of science. They agreed, and all of them attended the lectures voluntarily. I gave them a rapid sketch of the development of mathematics, taking as central theme the duality, continuous, discontinuous, and describing it as the attempt to deal with the continuous by means of the discontinuous, measurement itself being the first step. I told them the history of Greek science, similar triangles, tails and the pyramids, Pythagorean theorem, discovery of the incommensurable and the crisis it provoked, solution of the crisis by Eudoxus, theory of proportions, discovery by conics as sections of the cone, method of exhaustion, and of the geometry of early modern times, algebra, analytic geometry, principle of the differential and integral calculus. I explained to them, as no one had trouble to do, how the infinitesimal calculus was the condition for the application of mathematics to physics, and consequently for the contemporary effervescence of physics. All this was followed by all of them, even those most ignorant in science, with passionate interest, and was very easily fitted into 6 or 7 extra hours. Lack of time and my own insufficient knowledge prevented me from doing the same for mechanics and physics. All I could do was to tell them some fragments of the history of those sciences. They would have liked to have more. At the end of the series, I read them the terms of your inquiry into the historical method of teaching science, and they all enthusiastically approved the principle of such a method. They said it was the only method which could make pupils see science as something human instead of a kind of dogma which you have to believe without ever really knowing why. So this experiment completely confirms your idea from every point of view. Simone Weil, lecturer in philosophy at the Lycée for Girls Le Puy, Weil, 1965. She shocked inspectors and rectors alike when, eventually relieved of her position, and announced that she had always regarded dismissal as the normal culmination of her career. While at Le Puy, she had been allowed to go down and mine, and described the inappropriateness of the tool used, the pneumatic drill, to its operator. At present, he, the worker, forms a single body with the machine and is added to it like a supplementary gear, vibrating with the incessant shaking. This machine is not modeled on human nature, but rather of the nature of coal and compressed air. Perriman, 1977. To her mind, distortion of the correct relation of tool to user, one might almost say the reversal of that relation in capitalist production, was the major problem to be solved in industrial relations. She visited Germany in 1932. On her return, she expressed her respect and admiration for the German working class, and in a series of articles pointed out the similarities between National Socialism and Russian communism to the detriment of both. No nationalist movement based on solidarity between classes would, she believed, avert the disaster to which the German proletariat was rapidly being led. Upon her return to France, she was heartbroken, and events were soon to justify her acute distress. Hitler ordered the arrest of the most influential communists, and after the burning of the Reichstag at the beginning of the new parliamentary session in 1932, he announced that he had no further use for the socialists. It was at this time that Simone Weil wrote one of her most passionate political articles, entitled Towards the Proletarian Revolution. It was a scathing attack on unorthodox Russian communism, which she saw as a dictatorship of a bureaucratic class. She believed that no proper socialist system would emerge until productive labor itself became the dominating factor. She castigated a new form of oppression, which she called the oppression of the function. Trotsky, she said, had not gone nearly far enough in his criticism of Stalinist communism, which she viewed as a system of production in which labor itself is subordinated, by means of the machine, to the function consisting in coordination of labor. This article provoked Trotsky himself, who accused her of holding such views so as to defend her personality. She had written that true democracy is, by definition, nothing other than the subordination of society to the individual, and that this was also the true definition of socialism. She had seen society as a force of nature, as blind as all other natural forces, and no less dangerous to people unless they could achieve mastery of it. Kabul, 1964. After her transferal from Le Puy, she was posted to a school in Auxerre near Paris. Her reputation had preceded her, and relations between herself and both the administration and the colleagues were extremely strained. Her sojourn fell into the now familiar pattern of so-called tendentious teaching, angry complaints from school inspectors and anxious parents, examination failures from the ranks of the best students, followed by ultimate transferal. Much of her time and energy now, however, was devoted to taking care of some of the refugees who began to flee Germany. Her severe headaches continued, and if she made enemies from amongst her colleagues at school, she was not to find sympathetic supporters within the CGTU, the most powerful of the French trade unions. Her article had aroused the strongest resentment, and many workers considered that by it in the actions of the Communist Party in the USSR had been hideously distorted. However, her association with union members continued throughout the time she spent reaching at their different school, this time at Rouen in the Rhone Valley. No amount of pressure or persuasion could influence her to behave with greater restraint. She still continued to take part in the protest marches under the noses of alarmed parents whose children she taught every day. Accounts of her teaching show how deep was the affection and respect in which she was held by her students. Henri Renaud Guéritaux remembers that amongst the most enduring lessons she learned from Simone Weil was that the intelligence shows one must not seek to understand, that one cannot do good consciously, that all value and all virtue cannot of their very essence be understood as such. While at Rouen, a post which she had required so as to be close to her revolutionary syndicalist friends in Saint-Étienne, 70 or so miles away, she visited them regularly. She continued to teach in the study groups she had helped to set up there and to promote discussion of the issues she had raised in courageous speeches made at the Trade Union Congress in Reims some time previously. There, though threatened with physical assault, she had openly asserted that Stalin was collaborating with Hitler. She described the realities facing those now in fight from the Nazis and the betrayal by the Soviet communists of their German comrades. These unpalatable truths were difficult to utter in such places, and Simone Weil was not helped by her physical appearance and manner of speech. She looked and sounded like an intellectual. She was careless in her dress, often had cigarette burns in her clothes, and spoke in a rather monotonous tone. Largely thanks to her considerable powers of analysis and expression and the strength and passion of her conviction, she became a rallying point in the stormy meetings and demonstrations that took place during the famous general strikes in Saint Etienne in 1932. She was not, however, relieved on her post at Rouen. At the end of her year there, she applied for a leave of absence for personal studies in order to put into action a plan which she had had in mind since leaving the École Normale. In her application, she expressed it as follows: I would very much like to prepare a philosophical treatise dealing with the relationship between modern technology and basis of large-scale industry and the essential aspects of our civilization, by which I mean, on the one hand, our social organization, and on the other, our culture. Parlement 1977. Simone Weil was anxious to become an industrial worker and a bona fide member of the group she had represented intellectually at meetings and demonstrations at Saint-Étienne-le-Puy, Auxerre, and Rouen. Before entering the factory, she wrote as follows: Monsieur, I am late in replying because the rendezvous has been difficult to arrange. I cannot get to Moulins until quite late on Monday afternoon about 4 o'clock, and I would have to leave at 9. If you are free to give me an hour or two between those times, I will come. In that case, you have only to fix a definite meeting place, remembering that I don't know Moulins. I hope it will be possible, as I think it will be an advantage to talk rather than write. So the thoughts which your letters have suggested to me can wait until we meet. I will mention only one doubt which already occurred to me when I heard your lecture. You say, every man is both a link in some automatic series and also an instigator of trains of events. First of all, it seems to me one must distinguish the various degrees of activity and passivity in a man's relations with the trains or events which enter into his life. A man may originate trains of events, be an inventor. He may recreate them in thought, he may enact them without thinking them. He may be the occasion of trains or events thought or enacted by others, and so on. But this is something obvious. What worries me a little in this, when you say that an assembly line worker, for example, as soon as he comes out of the factory is free from the domain of the automatic series, you are clearly right. But what do you conclude from this? If you conclude that every man, however oppressed still, has the opportunity every day to act as a man and therefore never entirely forges his human status, very well. But if you conclude that the life of a worker at a conveyor belt in Renault or Citroën is an acceptable one for a man who wants to preserve human dignity, I cannot follow you. I don't think that is what you mean. In fact, I am sure it isn't, but I would like to get the point perfectly clear. Quantity changes into quality, as the Marxists say following Hegel. Both automatic series and motivated trains of events occur in all humans' lives, of course, but the question of proportion enters in, and it can be said in general way that automatic series cannot occupy more than a certain proportion of a man's life without degrading it. But I think we agreed about this. Well, 1965. She wished, by entering the manual workforce, to examine for herself the meaning of the phrase workers, control of production. This is the pivot upon which both her social and philosophical concerns rest. She defined liberty as being neither absence of constraint nor a relationship between desire and its satisfaction, but as a relationship between thought and action. The free person is he or she whose ever action proceeds from a preliminary judgment concerning the end which he or she has set and the sequence of means suitable for attaining this end. Petremont, 1977. Human beings are constantly aware of an abandoned necessity of series of constraints which bind their existence, even if it be only the constraint of morality. Being capable of thought, they may choose between responding like robots to stimuli that act upon them from outside or adapting to an inner representation of that necessity which is formed idiosyncratically. The choice determines whether they are free or not, and it is the possibility of making precisely that crucial choice which she believed had been removed from the lives of the factory workers. While near Saint Etienne, she had made many friends, amongst them Urbain and Albertine Thévenon, militant trade union teachers. The manner of their first meeting shows a certain ruthlessness in Simone Weil's character, which many people found intolerable. She rang the bell, and the door was opened by Albertine, one hand inside a sock that she was in the middle of darning. Having ascertained that Thévenon was in, she roughly shouldered his wife aside and walked past her into the room where he was sitting. The Thévenon recorded their surprise. Albertine subsequently became a close friend and wrote the introduction to Simone Weil's posthumously published factory journal. She, as well as others, objected strongly to Simone Weil's proposal of becoming a factory worker and said her minor friends had no sympathy for Roy Charbon experiments of this kind, in which the boss's son works in his father's mine incognito for a year before joining the board of directors. Secondly, they advised against this form of study on physical grounds. She was more ill-suited than most to perform the kind of work that she proposed. However, she ignored her friend's advice, and on her return to Paris took lodgings in the Rue Le Courbet, close to the Alstom electrical factory, where she eventually found a job as a power press operator. To Albertine, soon afterwards, she wrote, "Dear Albertine, I'm obliged to rest because of a slight illness, a touch of inflammation of the ear, nothing serious. So I seize the opportunity for a little talk with you. In a normal working week, it is difficult to make any effort beyond what I am compelled to make. But that's not the only reason I haven't written. It's also the number of things there are to tell and the impossibility to telling the essential. Perhaps later on I shall find the right words, but at the present it seems to me that I should need a new language to convey what needs to be said. Although this experience is in many ways what I expected it to be, there is also an abysmal difference. It is reality and no longer imagination. It is not that it has changed one or the other of my ideas. On the contrary, it has confirmed many of them. But infinitely more, it has changed my whole view of things, even my very feeling about life. I shall know joy again in the future, but there is a certain lightness of heart which, it seems to me, will never again be possible. But that's enough about it. To try to express the inexpressible is to degrade it. As regards to things that can be expressed, I have learned quite a lot about the organization of a firm. It is inhuman. Work broken down into small processes and paid by the piece, relations between different units of the firm, and different work processes organized in a purely bureaucratic way. One's attention has nothing worthily to engage it, but on the contrary, is constrained to fix itself second by second upon the same trivial problem, with only such variance as speeding up your output from 6 minutes to 5 for 50 pieces, or something of that sort. Thank heaven there are manual skills to be acquired, which from time to time lends some interest to this pursuit of speed. But what I ask myself is, how can all this be humanized? Because if the separate processes were not paid by the piece, the boredom they engender would inhibit attention and slow down the work considerably and produce a lot of spoiled pieces. And if the processes were not subdivided, but I have no time to go into all this by letter, only when I think that the great Bolshevik leaders proposed to create a free working class, and that doubtless none of them, certainly not Trotsky, and I don't think Lenin either, had ever set foot inside a factory, so that they hadn't the faintest idea of the real conditions which makes certitude of freedom for the workers, well, politics appears to me a sinister farce. I must point out that all I have said refers to unskilled labor. About skilled labor I have almost everything skill to learn. It will come, I hope. To speak frankly, for me this life is pretty hard, and the more so because my headaches have not been obliging enough to withdraw so as to make things easier, and working among machines with a headache is painful. It is only on Saturday afternoon and Sunday that I can breathe and find myself again and recover the ability to turn over a few thoughts in my head. In a general way, the temptation to give up thinking altogether is the most difficult one to resist in life like this. One feels so clearly that it is the only way to stop suffering. First of all, to stop suffering morally, because the situation itself automatically banishes rebellious feelings. To work with irritation would be to work badly, and so condemn oneself to starvation and leaving aside the work. There is no person to be a target for one's irritation. One dare not be insolent to the foreman, and moreover, they very often don't even make one want to be. So one is left with no possible feeling about one's own fate except sadness, and thus one is tempted to cease purely and simply from being conscious of anything except the sordid daily round of life. And physically too, it is a great temptation to lapse into semi-somnolence outside working hours. I have the greatest respect for workmen who manage to educate themselves. It is true they are usually tough, but all the same it must require a lot of stamina, and it is becoming more and more unusual with the advance of rationalization. I wonder if it is the same with skilled workers. I am sticking in the spite of evening, and I don't for one moment regret having embarked on the experience. Quite the contrary, I am infinitely thankful whenever I think of it. But curiously enough, I don't often think of it. My capacity for adaptation is almost unlimited, so that I am able to forget that I am qualified lecturer on tour in the working class, and to leave my present life as tough, and I had always been destined for it, which is true enough in a sense, and as tough it would last forever, and was imposed on me by electable necessity instead of my own free choice. But I promise you that when I can't stick it any longer, I'll go and rest somewhere, perhaps with you. I perceive I haven't said anything about my fellow workers. It will be for another time, but once again it is hard to express. They are nice, very nice, but as for real fraternity I have hardly felt any, with one exception: the storekeeper in the rule shop, a skilled worker and extremely competent, whom I appeal to whenever I am in despair over a job which I cannot manage properly, because he is 100 times nicer and more intelligent than the machine setters, who are not skilled workers. There is a lot of jealousy among the women, who are indeed obliged by the organization of the factory to compete with one another. I only know 3 or 4 who are entirely sympathetic. As for the men, some of them seem to be very nice types, but there aren't many of them in this shop where I work, apart from the machine setters, who are not real comrades. I hope to be moved to another shop after a time, so as to enlarge my experience. Well, au revoir, write soon. Simone Weil, 1965. She was paid at the piece rate and found that however hard she worked, she could not make enough to be properly nourished. The speed at which she worked was considerably too slow, since she could not train her mind to stop thinking. This in turn brought about anxiety and fear of not reaching the prescribed rate to be kept on, and she lived from day to day in the constant apprehension of being sick for the reaching their required quotas. The work was extremely hard, and during the next year she was to suffer burns, cuts and abscesses to accompany the headaches with which had never abated. She describes the reification of individual in the factory as one of the worst aspects of industrial life, and the arbitrariness with which the employee is hired, fired and manipulated. Under these conditions, the smallest act of kindness, a sympathetic smile, for example, comes to represent an indescribable favor. Indescribable. Inevitably, despite certain allowance which her foreman made for inexperience, she found herself eventually laid off. There followed a period in which she went from factory to factory, frequently exhausted from walking after not having had enough to eat, looking for work. By this time she did at least have a work permit, which had been initially difficult to obtain. She describes the feeling of comradeship which she felt with some others whom she met at this period, who were also looking for work as miracles. Her journal reads, Wednesday, divine weather with 2 fitters, one aged 18, the other 58. Very interesting, but extremely reserved, but obviously a real man, living alone, wife left him. His big interest in his hobby, photography. They killed cinema with the talkies instead of letting it to be what it really is. The most perfectly development of photography affects a certain cynicism, but obviously a man of heart. Conversation between the 3 of us the whole morning, extraordinarily free, easy, on a level above the pretty miseries of life, which are the overriding preoccupation of slaves, especially women. What a relief after Alstom. The young one is interesting too. As we were going along by St. Claude, he said, If I were in form, he isn't, alas, because he is hungry, I should draw. Everyone has something that interests him. For me, says the other one, it's photography. The young one asks me, And you, what is your passion? Embarrassed, I answer, reading. And he, Yes, I can imagine that, but not novels, more philosophic, wouldn't it be? Then we talk about Zola and Jack London. Clearly, both of them have revolutionary tendencies, but that's quite the wrong word. No, say rather that they have class awareness and the spirit of free men. But when we get on to national defense, we no longer agree. However, I don't insist. Complete comradeship for the first time in my life, really. No barrier, either in class difference, because it has been eliminated, or in sex. Miraculous.